talking about before, Labor does support this bill, but the reason why it supports this bill is because it's a remedial matters bill, and it also introduces changes to tax rules to allow New Zealanders to return home. Labor always supports sensible legislation that makes it easier for ordinary Kiwis to do, extraordinary Kiwis to do business and to do work. Now, I want to talk about a couple of bits of this bill, Mr Chair, just a couple of bits. What this does is it brings in Trans-Tasman portability of retirement savings. Sam Lotoinga actually hit the nail on the head. He said that this bill is actually going to help Kiwis coming home from Australia. Why is that? Because they have significantly greater savings than New Zealanders in New Zealand. New Zealanders in Australia have significantly greater savings because they have a superannuation scheme that has been going for a long time. New Zealand also had a superannuation scheme, Mr Chair. It was set up by Roger Douglas and it was cut by the national government. As my colleague Dr. David Cunliffe has alluded to, can you imagine the size of our capital markets now if that superannuation scheme had been allowed to continue forward like the Australian one? I think the estimation's around 30 billion, or is it 300? Sorry, $300 billion. The reason why we have such a saving deficit at the moment is because the National Party cut the superannuation scheme. The National Party cut it. And when Sam Lotoinga stands up and talks about the necessity of GST, what I would do is I would challenge that member to hold a public meeting in Mangakeke with the title, Why GST is Important. And I challenge him to do that. I know my colleague Carol Beaumont will come along and Sam will be ripped limb from limb. There is no reason why this increase in GST is important, especially when the money has been set aside for tax cuts for the wealthy. It is just not fair. Mr Chair, what I would like to talk about is Peter Dunn's SOP. This shows what an absolute shambles this whole GST implementation has been. Mr Dunn talked about Labor's introduction of GST in 1989, well over 20 years ago, and I would have hoped he might have learnt from that experience and come to the House with a bill that didn't need a 28-page SOP. In fact, you've got Ernst & Young, one of the large accountancy companies, throwing its hands up in frustration and saying, this is a lot more difficult than New Zealanders would thought. This is not a moderate increase. Those are the words from Ernst & Young, not from the Labour Party. We agree. A major accountancy company is highlighting the fact that this is an absolute shambles. In fact, I've heard stories that IRD staff are being inundated by calls around questions to do with this GST that they simply do not have answers to. They're tearing their hair out because the IRD staff themselves do not know the answers. Mr Dunn set up a GST commission. It was a mighty fine idea. It's reported back with this 23-page SOP, but obviously it hasn't been communicated to the IRD staff on the ground. But the reason why we support Mr Dunn's SOP is because it has to be done. There's no way you can put through such a flawed bill that leaves so many holes where taxpayers don't know if they're Arthur or they're Martha. That is what we are supporting. We are supporting the integrity of the tax system. We are not supporting an increase in GST. We have never supported an increase in GST. And when we went to the people of New Zealand, from Kaitaia to Bluff, none of them supported an increase in GST at all. This is an absolute shambles. Now, let's talk about the savings history timeline. In 1974, Mr Chair, Labor and the Kirk government introduced a compulsory superannuation scheme. As mentioned, Roger Douglas was the architect. In fact, as an aside, I think it's actually quite sad when the last speech I heard Roger Douglas give was a rort on workers' rights. This is a man whose father and grandfather were Labour Party MPs. Labour Party philosophy is in his blood, but at some point he turned to the dark side and he is now giving speeches in the House against the rights of workers. But anyway, Mr Chair,
I think I'll take Claire Curran, who's sought the call because she hasn't had a call. I'm trying to be equal-handed. Claire Curran.